Hi, my name is Courtney Kroger, and this is my case study, A Good Teacher Turns Bad. So a summary of the case study: Mrs. Wilson is the principal of Crestview Elementary School. She's been there for 8 years, but recently she's been receiving an email and phone calls from parents complaining about one of their teachers, Mrs. Horton, who is a first grade teacher. Many of the parents are very upset with Mrs. Horton's behavior, saying their parents are saying that they're calling the students bad names, she's yelling at them in class, there's no positive learning experience at all for these students. So the parents are very upset with how she's treating their children. The parents want answers and for their children to be out of her classroom. So the principal, Mrs. Wilson, is trying to find a solution to figure out what is going on. So category 1, what do you know? We know that Mrs. Wilson is the principal of Crestview Elementary School, and she's been there for about 8 years. Crestview Elementary School is a small school with 18 teachers, 4 special teachers, and 3 aides. And when Mrs. Wilson first got there, the teachers were happy, the parents were happy, so she didn't want to change anything to start out with. Just this year, recently, they decided to pick up a new reading curriculum, though, and it has caused some dispute among the teachers. The teachers and parents, like I said, have been very happy, but Mrs. Horton, who is a first grade teacher and a veteran teacher, is starting to have some trouble at home. We know that she's having problems with her husband, and her husband has recently left her, so she's struggling with things at home. So that has made Mrs. Horton very confrontational. It's made her have problems with other teachers. It's made her have problems in the classroom, and parents have been making complaints. The parents are very unhappy with her performance in the classroom. They're very unhappy with how she's treating their children. They're also very unhappy with what their children are coming home and saying that she's saying to them. So they are wanting their children removed from their classroom. Mrs. Horton is refusing to have any parent-teacher conferences. So Mrs. Wilson, the principal, has been going in to observe Mrs. Horton, and she has not seen any of these behaviors while she's in there. Mr. Stafford comes into the picture, who is a parent of a student in Mrs. Wilson's classroom, and he is very concerned because his daughter no longer wants to come to school. She's crying every day, very upset, so Mr. Stafford wants to meet with Mrs. Horton, but Mrs. Horton refuses. So Mrs. Wilson, the principal, decides to set up a meeting between Mr. Horton, Mrs. Horton, Mr. Stafford, and herself to discuss what is going on in the classroom. When they get there, Mrs. Horton is very angry and very rude to Mr. Stafford. So things left with no answers. So the meeting is dismissed, and Mrs. Wilson decides that she needs to figure something out of what is going on. So what do we need to know? We need to know what is going on in the classroom, why Mrs. Horton is behaving the way that she is, how the students are feeling, if the accusations from the parents are true, and we also need to know why Mrs. Horton won't speak to any of the parents, and why Mrs. Wilson hasn't been notifying Mrs. Horton of all of the emails and phone calls coming in with unpleased parents, because that could have been something that maybe have resolved a long time ago if Mrs. Horton knew that all these parents were upset. So also, why has a meeting not been set up yet between the principal and Mrs. Horton, and possibly even the superintendent, to get things cleared up? We also need to know, how can Mrs. Wilson, the principal, help Mrs. Horton? Maybe she's feeling the stress in the classroom as well as things at home. Maybe there's something Mrs. Wilson could do to help Mrs. Horton take some stress off of her shoulders. So maybe some time off from the classroom would help. We also need to know what the rules and policies in the school district are for changing teachers mid-year, if that's even a possibility. And then also, what are the grounds for dismissal of a teacher mid-year if things don't improve? Because if there's this many unhappy parents and unhappy children, there needs to be something taking place. So what is the problem? Mrs. Horton, a first grade teacher, is having problems at home, which is then leading into problems at school. She's become very distant towards her colleagues, having problems with them, causing many fights. She's become very confrontational, disagreeing with many people at school, and many accusations are being made of her teaching in her classroom. Like I said, she's a first grade teacher, and the teachers or the parents of these students are saying that she's very rude to their children, yelling at them in class, not treating them with respect, and so there's not a positive learning experience going on. Mrs. Wilson, the principal, is receiving emails and phone calls from many parents, and the parents are very upset. Also, parents are wanting their children removed from her classroom, and Mrs. Wilson hasn't notified Mrs. Horton of any of these things until Mr. Stafford brings up that he wants to meet with them. So a meeting or an observation has not been set up between Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Horton, which should have happened a long time ago. Mr. Stafford wants his daughter removed from the classroom immediately, and Mr. Stafford wants to meet with Mrs. Horton to discuss what is going on in the classroom. Mrs. Horton, though, says that all of it is lies and gets very upset and yells at Mr. Stafford. So, propose plan of action with appropriate strategies for implementation. Step 1. Mrs. Wilson needs to meet with Mrs. Horton to discuss everything that is going on. She needs to discuss the emails that she's received, the phone calls she's received, and talk with Mrs. Horton about possibly what's going on at home that's causing her to act this way in school. Mrs. Wilson also needs to set up observations weekly or even daily to come in and watch Mrs. Horton to observe her behavior with her students. Step 3, Mrs. Wilson needs to contact the superintendent to let him know or her know of what's going on in Mrs. Horton's classroom. We would hate for the superintendent to hear of these things from parents or other people outside the school instead of from the principal herself. Step 4, parent-teacher conferences need to be set up between Mrs. Horton and parents to discuss what's going on in the classroom and to maybe help some of the parents feel better. Step 5 is a meeting needs to be set up with Mr. Stafford and Mrs. Horton to discuss Mr. Stafford's concerns with his daughter and Mrs. Horton. Step 6, there needs to be look up the school policies and procedures for switching teachers mid-year. Step 7, possibly set up a mentoring program for Mrs. Horton, maybe with a fellow teacher or colleague. I know that Mrs. Horton is has been there for a long time, but maybe she could learn some positive behavior techniques, things like that from another teacher. Step 8, contact the KNEA about legal issues, because if this continues, there will be some parents who will be filing lawsuits against Mrs. Horton and her behavior towards their children. Step 9, discuss grounds for removal suspension with Mrs. Horton if her behavior does not change. Step 10, there needs to be a meeting set up with Mr. Stanford, Mrs. Wilson, Mrs. Horton, and the superintendent to discuss what's going on in the classroom, how things are going to be changed, and what will happen if things are not fixed. That way Mr. Stafford has a sense of ease sending his daughter back into that classroom. In step 11, after everything is solved, Mrs. Wilson needs to meet with the staff about all the rules and regulations and her expectations for teachers in the classroom. Category 3, resolve the issues based on promoting the success of all students. So, Mrs. Wilson needs to start setting up mandatory observations for Mrs. Horton to make sure that her behavior in the classroom is acceptable. She also has to have mandatory parent-teacher conferences if a parent wants to meet with her and discuss what's going on in the classroom. She can't just shut parents out. She has to have open communication to them. She also needs to have positive communication between her students, other teachers, and parents, and positive talk towards all. She should not be yelling at her students or treating them with no respect. Also, we can promote the success of all students by having a mentoring program for Mrs. Horton, so she learns how to have positive behavior and positive talk in her classroom, and she needs to be on a probationary period where if her attitude and her behavior doesn't change, then that might be grounds for dismissal. So to debrief the problem, first, what were you thinking? I was thinking that there needs to be a positive learning environment set in place so that they can have the safety of all the students. The students need to be able to come to school enjoying school, and there needs to be a positive communication between all. I was feeling very concerned for Mrs. Horton because obviously there's something very serious going on at home for her to completely change her attitude about school. And also concerned for the students. It's not fair for first grade students to be treated, or any students to be treated that way by their teacher, to hate to come to school and not want to come. And also concerned that there needs to be a parent-teacher conferences set up and in place, and concerned why Mrs. Horton will not meet with any of the parents. I was valuing Mr. Stafford's concerns for his daughter. He's obviously putting his daughter first, which is how it should be, and he needs a sense of ease knowing that his daughter will want to go to school, because right now his daughter hates school. I was also valuing Mrs. Wilson's effort to set up a meeting between Mr. Stafford and Mrs. Horton, and valuing the parents' concerns because, like I said, they need to put their children first, and right now they're very concerned with their children's education. So some issues that are still unresolved. We still are not sure if Mrs. Horton's problems at home have gotten any better to where maybe her attitude will change about school. We are not sure about Mrs. Horton's attitude towards others and why she's treating them that way. We are not sure about the learning environment and the climate and culture of her classroom. And and that is something that needs to be fixed before she's maybe not off of her probationary period. We need to know why there are reasons for lack of communication and why she won't talk to any of the parents and why she's so confrontational towards Mr. Stanford. So reflecting on Standard 2, which is talking about promoting the academic success of all students, Mrs. Horton will now be on a probationary period, and in that probationary period, if her attitude and behavior doesn't change towards her students and her teaching, then maybe that is grounds for dismissal. She will also be receiving a mentoring program to learn how to create a positive learning environment in her classroom. She will have mandatory observations, maybe by the superintendent and Mrs. Wilson. Mrs. Wilson will check in with the students to see how they are feeling, if they feel comfortable in Mrs. Horton's classroom, and if things have changed. Mrs. Wilson will meet with the parents and staff to discuss what is going on and how there is a plan of action being set in place, and rules and regulations will be set in place, and Mrs. Wilson will tell all the teachers what her expectations are of their teachers. So component 1, promoting the academic success of every student. Like I said before, there needs to be a positive learning environment. Students need to be in an environment that they know that they can succeed in, and they are getting love and comfort in, that they feel safe in. Right now they do not feel safe in Mrs. Horton's classroom, so that is not leading to the success of every student. We also need to find a teacher to support the students' needs. So if Mrs. Horton cannot do that after her probationary period, then maybe she needs to be let go, and there could be a long-term sub for the rest of the school year. Parent-teacher conferences need to be put in place to discuss student needs, and this needs to happen at least twice a year, and whenever a parent wants to talk to Mrs. Horton about what's going on in the classroom. And then a mentor program to work on positive talk in the classroom. All of these things will lead to the success of every student. Component 2, promote the personal well-being of every student. Once again, the positive learning environment, this is huge for the well-being of every student. If they don't have a positive learning environment, they're not getting what they need. Also, positive communication between teachers and students, teachers and parents, and positive attitudes towards not only the students but also towards the staff and everyone else. And then component 3, enhance the instructional capacity. There needs to be mandatory observations in the classroom with Mrs. Horton to ensure that her students are getting the academic needs, that they are meeting all of the academic needs and getting the instructions that they deserve. Mrs. Wilson needs to also set up a mentor program for Mrs. Horton to make sure that she's teaching her students appropriately, and that a plan of assistance will be set up for Mrs. Horton so that she can get all the help that she deserves and that she needs at this time, because it's very critical. So that is the end of my case study. Thank you.